So, Bone Rider here, and I wanted to talk about the difference between Cutlass versus Katana. Um, Now, somebody might say, well, that's kind of a weird combination. Yeah, they're very different swords from very different cultures, from very different purposes in history, of a very different construction. And yet, you'll notice one thing here, if I hold them like this, they're actually not that dissimilar in general in how the blades appear. In fact, if I put the hilts level, you'll notice that one's only about an inch or so longer than the other. But looking straight on, you'll see they both have fairly broad, fairly thick, slightly curved blades with what we can call a hatchet point, or a point in line with the spine of the blade. As you can see there. That would be as opposed to, let's say, a spear point, where the point is centrally located. And some cutlasses did have this, in British 1804, etc. But this is a replica, of course, of the French 1801, minus the bowl guard, which I removed because I was going for more of a hanger style hilt. And you'll notice that the spine on this is very, very, very thick, especially near the base. A lot thicker than many modern reproductions. This, of course, was made some years ago and then just sort of kept in storage. So, you know, it's not a surprise that it's pretty well made. Now, the material of the blades is obviously very different. A katana, of course, is traditionally made using, I think what they call tamahagani. Probably butchering the pronunciations, but it's essentially very low-grade ore that's basically hammered and folded over and over again to take out the impurities and make it into a usable steel. This requires obviously a lot of skill on the part of the smith, but the reason they did it wasn't because of any magical properties of that. It was because they were trying to make not so great steel usable. So the result is the blades were usually very thick, usually fairly short, and usually not spring tempered like a European blade. So something like this Cutlass, even though it's very stiff, it's hard to bend it because of the thick spine. If you do bend it, it'll spring back. It has a spring temper. Something like this, at least the traditionally made one, if you bent it, it would probably stay bent because typically only the edge was hardened, the spine and back of the blade was left soft. And that's one of the main differences between Western blades and let's say Japanese swords. Is Japanese swords, generally speaking, were differentially hardened. Western swords, generally speaking, were tempered. Now this is a modern reproduction of a katana type sword. So this, of course, is made out of mono steel and it's through hardened. But nevertheless, I would say this is not spring tempered. If you look at the thickness of that spine, even considering how thick the Cutlass is, the katana is way thicker and it maintains its thickness further along the edge as well. So if you bent this, it probably would stay bent just because of how thick it is. And it may be through hardened rather than differentially hardened, but I do not believe this is spring tempered, as it were. But let's ignore all that and let's just look at how the blades work, right? Each of these is a fairly wide, fairly thick spined blade with a point that is in line with the back of the blade. This means you can cut all the way to the end of the blade very effectively. Think of the 1796 saber. Think of certain styles of Bowie knife. That's essentially the type of point that this Cutlass has. But it's also, with some slight variation, essentially the type of point that this katana has, if you think about it, right? This looks more abrupt. There's clearly like a corner here between the edge of the blade and the edge of the tip, but in profile like this, it is essentially the same thing. The front edge curves around to meet the tip where it is in line with the end of the blade. It's just more squared off in this version. But again, what that allows you to do is cut very effectively all the way to the end of the blade with either of these swords. And again, looking at blade length, you know, you've got a little over 26, you've got about 28 inches, I believe. So the katana is a few inches longer, but you know, the Cutlass is designed to be short, essentially. It's a miniaturized, beefed up saber. It's designed to be short primarily because of use on ship, use in close quarters environment. The katana is designed to be short, I think, for another reason. I'm not a katana expert, but you know, using logic, using what we know about how they were made and the limitations of the steel and the raw materials on an island, I think the katanas were short because they didn't want to make them too long, because that would be a lot harder given the metallurgy they were working with. Now, it is worth noting that they did have extremely long swords, basically the equivalent of the European greatsword, things like, I think they were called nodachi, so it was, you know, a giant two-handed katana-type bladed swords. And these did exist, so you could say, well, obviously they were able to make a longer blade. Yeah, but it was probably more difficult, and those were probably a lot more expensive to make because of it. So, you know, as far as, well, why wasn't every sword the size of a nodachi? Well, it's really cumbersome, and that's a very specialized weapon. But as far as why wasn't every sword, katana sword anyway, slightly longer, let's say, it probably would have been a lot more expensive, and, you know, risk having, you know, the blade more susceptible to damage, etc. It also may have had to do with the style of combat and simply the way they were used, right? These were sidearms. Their main weapons were pole arms or bows, generally speaking, or swords that might as well be a pole arm, like a nodachi. And in that sense, it's similar to the use of the sword in Europe. With a few exceptions, the sword was a sidearm and like a backup. So it was what you would use, you know, what you would carry when you weren't on the battlefield and you didn't have a battlefield weapon in hand, or it was what you would carry on the battlefield as a backup in case your main weapon failed, broke, got lost, whatever, where you had to move it to close quarters where it was no longer useful. So if your main weapon was a bow or a crossbow or a spear or a halberd or a yari or whatever, and then your backup weapon might be a sword. And the only times that, like I said, with rare exceptions, the only times that swords were the main weapon was if you were in a situation where you couldn't carry something like a pole arm or a bow, or if you were using a sword that was so big that it essentially took the place of a pole arm. Like in Europe, for example, the so-called Zweihand, or a two-handed sword, was often used against pikemen. People say it was used to cut the tips off pikes. I don't believe that. The shafts of these things are huge, and they have metal languets running down the sides. Also, they flex. They bend. If somebody's going to be, you know, holding a 16-foot long pike and you're going to try and chop it, a lot of that force isn't going into the cut. A lot of that force is going to be, you know, used up by the bending of the haft of the pike. To say nothing of the person moving it in their hands or letting it move to absorb most of the blow or maybe even dodge it, right? I don't believe you're going to be chopped. Now, could you damage a pike? Yes. I think when they say these were used against pikemen, I don't think they meant that they were used to chop up the pikes. I think it was that they were used to chop up the pikemen, not the pikes. That they were used to disrupt the pike formations, not to cut the tips off the pikes. But be that as it may, nevertheless you had a sword, which normally is a sidearm, was here essentially put in the position of the main battlefield weapon, being used against other main battlefield weapons. It would be like somebody taking on a group of riflemen with a pistol. Well, you can't really do that very effectively, but if you're, all of a sudden, if your pistol is like, you know, 50 caliber Desert Eagle or something, it becomes a little more feasible, in that sense. It's the same idea here. It's the sword as a sidearm, unless it's not, right? Unless it's either you're in a situation where it's close quarters, so you need a sword, you can't use a spear or a halberd or whatever, or where your sword is essentially like a spear because it's so big. But as far as the lengths on these, the Cutlass was made shorter because use in close quarters on shipboard. The Katana, I think, was made shorter. Part of it may have been the fact that it was a secondary, it was a backup. It was carried on a battlefield and off. So in civilian quarters, you can imagine if you were in a building or in downtown streets, you do want a shorter weapon, same as you'd want a shorter weapon on board ship. But I also think there's a metallurgy consideration, because if you look at the swords that are used outside in battlefields in other cultures, a lot of them tend to be a little bit longer, 2, 3, 4 inches longer sometimes, right? I mean, most medieval one-handed swords are longer than this, if only by an inch or two. Most medieval two-handed swords are like half a foot longer than this. And this is a two-handed sword, which is the last part I want to address. The Katana, unlike the Cutlass, is designed for use in two hands. And it also has a minimal guard. The Suba or disc guard is fairly small. If a blade comes down, it certainly might prevent it from cutting your hand. But it's not going to catch any swings that come like this, right? And the thing about this being a two-handed weapon and this being a one-handed weapon, and then looking at the length, and why would you have a two-handed weapon that is that short, right? Especially since you're going to be cutting with it. And slashes generally don't give you the reach of thrusts anyway. So, if you think about it, and if you're using it two-handed, you're not going to be able to extend it as far as you could with one hand. So you're already, when you go to a two-handed weapon, you're already losing a little bit of reach, essentially. I mean, if you use the same weapon in two hands versus one hand, you're losing reach. So then you think about it, and you're like, well, and the blade's shorter than most other two-handed swords anywhere else in the world. Why is that? I honestly think it does have something to do with the, like I said, with the metallurgy going into the blades. But these were very effective for what they were designed, which is up-close, two-handed slashing and slicing. They were also very good thrusters in some degree, in the sense of they're very stiff blades. So, and they have a very robust point. So we'll go into things, which is something I don't think a lot of people appreciate, by the way, about these hatchet points. Even on this Cutlass, where the point is much, much thinner, it nevertheless is a very effective thruster. And a lot of times, again, the belief is that a spear point, which is more in line with the center of the blade, is more effective at thrusting. And I'm quite certain that's true as far as that goes. But it does not mean that one of these is not very effective at penetrating material. So, there's that. And then lastly, of course, we have the guards. The Cutlass is a very protective guard with a knuckle bow and often a bow guard, or an enlarged knuckle bow. The bow guard was removed on this one because I was going for more of a simple saber or hanger style hilt, but you can see where it was attached on that side, the bronze, or the brass rather, brazing residue. I have to polish that off. So these had a very protective hilt. And I think part of that is that they were used in one hand, so they were held out. So you're going to want more advanced protection for the hand there. The katanas, of course, were used in two hands and were therefore held closer to the body. And so, the need for advanced or complicated handguard is not there. Also, how do you make a really complicated handguard for a two-handed sword? You really, there's very few I've ever seen. I have seen a two-handed so-called Swiss saber, or at least photos of one, where they had almost like a basket guard for the top part of a two-handed longsword grip. But the truth is that, generally speaking, two-handed swords you need to be able to move your hands on the blade, and I guess you could have just a really long knuckle bow, but it would be kind of awkward, right? And again, the way they're used, if you think about it, a lot of longsword guards and a lot of katana guards are actually very similar. I mean, in longsword, something like this would be ox, fool's guard, etc. But the guard positions are all with the sword held back, retracted until the moment you go to strike. And the reason for that, I think, is, well, twofold. I mean, there's no advantage to holding it out like this, right? And secondly, if you did, your hands would get sniped. So, this was, I don't think this developed a complex guard for the dual reasons of the fact that it doesn't need it, because the way you're holding the sword, a lot of your positions are retracted anyway. And secondly, so you're not holding it out at arm's length. You don't need a complicated handguard the way you would with a one-handed sword like a saber or a cutlass, where you a lot of times are holding it out at arm's length. And then, of course, because it's a two-handed weapon, even if you could put a complicated guard and decided you needed one, it would get in the way of your second hand moving on the handle. So there we go. Just a few things. I know it's kind of weird to put a cutlass up against a katana, but they're both, pretty darn cool swords that are superficially similar. Again, if you're only looking at the blade profile, but they have a lot of differences, and just two interesting things to consider. And then, of course, I mean, think about it for what it's worth. Pirates versus samurai, right? Yeah. But no, seriously, two very cool, very iconic swords from history that are very different, but also, like I said, superficially similar in a lot of ways. So, Lone Rider out.